Good evening, everyone. How are you? Yeah, David again here. Yeah, welcome back for the Pre-Uni New College Townsley Information webinar. Yeah, it's good to see you all again. Yeah, during this webinar, during this week, we went through all the information about the OC exam, starting from the thinking skill component. And yesterday, we discussed about the OC application procedure and also test format and scoring system, and most of all, our exam preparation courses until the exam date. So tonight, as the last session of the OC webinar, we will find more details about the new OC reading test component. So as a presenter of tonight's webinar, I'd like to introduce Ms. Kelly Jones, who has been worked for Pre-Uni for many years as a secondary English teacher, including HSC. So, hello, Kelly.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, I can see you. Thank you.
Great.
For joining tonight's webinar.
Thank you for having me. No problem.
Okay. So, Ms. Kelly is currently teaching Year 5 STTC as well. And also, she's working closely with our development and research team, involving lots of new testing and test question development for OCTTC and STTC. So I'm quite happy about her performance and achievement for our college. So yes, I believe she will provide very valuable information tonight. So okay, let's get started. Please welcome tonight's presenter, Kelly.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so yes, my name is Kelly Jones. I'm a secondary English teacher and I have been working with Pre-Uni for many, many years and working recently as an educational consultant as well. So I'm very happy to be here tonight to give you some information on the new style of OC reading test and how you can best prepare for that test coming up next year and into the future. So on your screen, you should see just an overview of tonight's session. We have firstly an introduction to the reading comprehension skills that are covered in the OC test. I'll talk specifically then about gap texts and what they look like, what they require. Following that, we'll talk about multiple matching texts. And then at the end, I will just discuss some of the most common, I think, challenges students face in terms of time management during the test conditions. Okay, so the reading comprehension section of the OC test is different to the past. There's been a few changes, and that's because there's been a shift from, rather than a focus on memorization and just recalling of facts, now the Department of Education wants to really focus on testing skills in thinking and reasoning so that students are able to find the best answer rather than just simply being able to recall information. So I'll talk more about that later and the benefits of that and also how students can best prepare for the new approach to that style. Okay, so as David has said, and you know, there are three types of test. There's the reading skills and mathematical skills, and also thinking skills. So for both the gap text and multiple matching, there are, both of them test a very wide variety of reading comprehension skills. So on your screen, you should be able to see just a list of some of the main types of reading comprehension skills. And I'll just go through a few of them with you. Really, multiple matching and the gap text, they draw on a really wide variety of text. So some of them are fiction, some are non-fiction. Fiction extracts might include things like poetry or extracts from novels or narratives. Non-fiction text will include things like information reports, articles, and also extracts from other non-fiction type texts. Both of them are multiple choice. So the multiple choice questions are looking to gauge the student's ability to find these skills. So if you just look from the top down, we've got finding main ideas, recalling facts and details. Now that's not necessarily just from the text that the students read, but it's also to do with their general knowledge and background knowledge. Understanding sequence of a text. So this really relies on students being able to identify signal words that show sequence and also cause and effect. So that's words like because, as, since, therefore. The same with comparing and contrasting. The students need to be able to recognize the language that indicates a comparison, like similar, unlike, contrary, regardless, etc. You know, there's long lists of those words. Making predictions. So that's using the information that the students can gauge very quickly from looking at the extracts and then making predictions about what they expect to find in the questions. But the questions also ask inference style information of them. Finding word meanings in context. So these are the questions that really, they do focus on vocabulary, and students that have a broad vocabulary will benefit from that because they'll be able to, you know, perhaps identify these difficult words. But students that don't, or many students won't know the words, but they'll be able to decipher the meaning by the sentence that it appears in. Then we have distinguishing between facts and opinions. Again, there's a list of signal words that help students identify an opinion, for example, the word think or believe or should or best. The author's purpose is really important, and that's something that through the skimming and scanning process I'll talk about. Students should be able to identify very quickly if the text is for information or persuasion, or is it an entertainment text. Then there is figurative language. There's usually always questions about similes, metaphors. If it's to do with poetry, for example, having a good understanding of poetry techniques helps. And finally, summarizing and paraphrasing. This one is really, really important, particularly with the multiple matching text. And that's because most of the skills are actually about retelling or paraphrasing simply sentences or phrases that have been removed from the text. So we'll look at some of those as we go. Okay, so to begin with, what is a gap text in the OC test? So it reflects very closely the selective gap text as well. They're usually about 500 to 600 words long. So that's like approximately a page or a little bit more with formatting. 6 sentences have been removed, and then the students are provided with 7 options. So obviously one of those options doesn't fit, it's wrong, it doesn't belong in the text, and the students will need to discern, you know, which ones belong in what place and which one is left out completely. So basically a gap text is a comprehension, a reading comprehension test, of course. Most of the questions, from what I've seen from the department's examples, focus on those reading skills from the previous slide. And they usually always cover the main idea. They look for sequencing of ideas and events, the context, details, and facts, and of course the author's purpose. Okay. Now, the million-dollar question is why? Why did the department decide to make these changes? So in 2018, you might be aware the department did a review of selective education access. So that the report, you can actually find that on the department's website if you want to read it in detail. But that gave information to the department about some of the weaknesses and strengths of the current selective, or the current then selective system. And based on that report, they made these changes. So mainly, you should know that the changes have made the test more equitable, and it now is a much more even playing field for all students. So the gifted students that succeed in these tests succeed because of their ability and not necessarily their background. So they shouldn't be unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged depending on any part of their background. Instead, now the test is really focused on the ability of students to think and reason and also be creative, rather than just recalling or memorizing information. They have changed, the department have changed the difficulty, if you like, of the test to make sure that it's really well matched to align to the ability of gifted students that will succeed. And they've also aimed to reduce the predictability of the test. So I want to talk about predictability for a moment, because obviously we want to be able to know as much as possible going into the test. The students want to feel as they know as much as they can. And whilst we can't predict the exact text types, of course, or the extracts, we can predict the types of questions that will be asked. And I suppose that's the benefit of these practices. You're able to get a really good sense of what those types of reading comprehension questions are and be able to prepare for how to answer them best. So, what skills are being assessed? Really, in the gap text, students are being asked to look at the context. So they have paragraphs. I'll show you an example in a minute, but there's paragraphs and paragraphs of information, and then select sentences or phrases have been taken out. The students need to understand where that sentence belongs in context. So sometimes the texts, the extracts, are about topics that are age appropriate, but perhaps the students haven't learned. They're not familiar with that topic, and that's okay. That's okay, because there's going to be lots of signals that give hints and clues as to which sentences belong in context in those paragraphs. The other thing is vocabulary. So the students that succeed or I suppose find the test easiest are those that have a broad vocabulary. It's really useful because, number one, they are able to know the meanings of many, many words, but also they might be able to take clues from base meanings or words that derive from, for example, Greek or Latin backgrounds with prefixes or suffixes. They might be able to get clues from those meanings. So having a broad vocabulary is really valuable. To get a broad vocabulary, it takes years. That's not something you can, simply pick up in a study session or two. So reading, if the students read really widely, that's extremely beneficial for a couple of reasons. One, it increases their vocabulary, but two, it's also improving their fluency. And all the time they're improving their English fluency, it's allowing them to read faster and more accurately. So that means later the recall of information and details is that much easier for them because of that vocabulary. Parts of speech that belong in the deleted passages, what that's referring to is looking for how the sentences are structured. Are they in the past tense? Are they present? Are they a dependent clause or an independent clause? Might it be following on from a main idea? Can you use signal words such as therefore or after to be able to link the gaps in the text? So those are some of the tips that we talk about to the students to help them in the test. In that sense, some of it is predictable still. Okay, next slide you should see on your screen here an example. It's a sample from the Department of Education of one of the gapped texts. So in the test, you'll see there is, in this case, I think 5 or 6, 7 perhaps, paragraphs. The topic is drumming cockatoos, so this one's from an information report. The whole first paragraph has nothing removed from it. The students still need to read that because that is where they're getting all their context, all their orientation for the text. When I talk to students about skimming and scanning, the orientation or the introductory paragraph is the most important. That's where you get your main idea. It's where you will find, the tone and the purpose of the text. Likely, not in this case, but usually as well, the author, which can give you a lot of information, and also direct you as to how the text is going to be structured. The introduction should list in the right sequence the order of topics as the paragraphs go down. So I know students sometimes have a tendency to just skip any paragraph that isn't missing a gap. Don't do that. And definitely don't skip the introduction. That's where you get, a large chunk of your information to be able to make assumptions, predictions, inferences for the rest of the text. Now, some other advice about how to prepare. Well, looking around the gap. So the answer will come from keywords or inferences that you can make from the sentences around the gap. So they might include the topic sentence that should have the main idea of that paragraph within it, and the sentence before and after the gap. They're critical clues to be able to help you match up which sentence will belong. Of course, you can, and some students do this, you can just trial and error. It's a strategy. It takes a very long time, and that's a problem. Time. Well, it's not a problem, it's a challenge. Because there is a time constraint, you don't want to be spending a great deal of time on trial and error. What that means is, for example, taking sentence A and seeing if it fits in 12, seeing if it fits in 13, seeing if it fits in 14. It takes a long time to eliminate. So there needs to be other strategies. And those keywords, looking at the topic sentence and the sentences before and after, are key to that. Another thing is how fast a student can accurately read that text. Like running a race at the Olympics, reading is a skill that you get better at with exercise. So my advice is to always encourage reading any text. It doesn't need to be academic, because all that time reading exercises children, but teenagers and even adults' brains to be able to read more fluently and then be able to recall that information. Okay, so I'll just move through to the second new type of reading comprehension test in the OC. Again, this is reflected in the selective high school test as well. So it's a similar style that you can become familiar with. Multiple matching texts are very simply reading comprehensions that use paraphrased sentences, or what I've said here is like in other words, saying things in other words. A multiple matching text has 4 extracts, and those extracts are based on one particular topic or a theme, and then there are 8 clues provided to the students. I'll show you an example in a moment of how that one works. Again, there are about 600 to 800 words, so that's a page or a page and a half. That's all together, all 4 extracts combined. And that has a reading time, for a year 4 or 5 student, that has a reading time of anywhere between, 5 to maybe 8 minutes, depending on the density. So this is where, fluent reading and practice reading is such a beneficial exercise. Again, it's really the same reasons why multiple matching has been included. The Department of Education wanted this part of the test as well to be more equitable. Again, they want to test thinking and reasoning skills and not memory and recall. Also, they're looking for gifted and talented students, or students who are highly capable. So high-end skills or difficult skills include things like reasoning and creativity and making or taking implied knowledge and making judgments, drawing conclusions. So those are the really high-end skills, I suppose, that they're looking for in this multiple matching test. And it's not simply just identifying or finding information that is obviously just taking a fact from the text. So we're looking to put things in other words. It's really about paraphrasing. The skills that have been assessed by multiple matching are, as I've said, about paraphrased information and clues. So we use the word clues because, you know, it's nice and simple to understand, but for us educators, we're talking about inference. Clues indicates someone's ability to infer a lot of information or implied information and then come to a conclusion or make a judgment about that. Sometimes the information could be very explicit. That means, you know, it's quite obvious. It's told in the text. Other times it's literal. Other times it's figurative. So using an extended metaphor or lots of mixed metaphors or allegories. And yeah, that's for implied and inferential information. So on the screen now, you should see an example of a multiple matching test. There's 4 extracts down the right. Extracts, they're always labeled A, B, C, D. And then on the left, you should see the clues. So it asks them to look at which extract matches with each one of those clues. They're not like the gap text in that the sentences do not belong, you know, word for word, like they have not just been extracted from the text and put to the side. These are it's paraphrased information that needs to be worked through. So the best approach for this, well, there's a few different approaches and it depends on what works for each student because every student works differently and processes differently. So you really need to find what works best for each individual. But one of the approaches can be to read the clues first, and the test is still on paper at the moment. So highlight or underline key words, so main ideas or key verbs that appear in those clues, and then read the extracts. As you're reading the extracts, you'll likely be able to draw some links, even just possible links to start with. Oh, I think this one belongs in B. I think this one belongs in C. And then go through more closely in detail to match them at the end. Another approach is to read the extracts first and work backwards. I find that's more time consuming. Then again, I have taught students who much prefer that style and do very well. So it really depends on the student. And this is where practice is such a benefit. You're able to experiment and explore with different approaches to the test and find out which one works best for you. These 4 extracts are on the theme of the sea, but they're all different texts. So I'm certainly not going to read through all those, and it's quite small on the screen, but if I just quickly summarize for you, extract A, for example, as a marker, as a teacher, as a person who drafts and creates these tests, these are the types of key ideas I can identify straight away, and I know there'll be questions about them. So extract A, it's written in first person. So it's a reflection. It's written in the past tense. There's personal tone, there's figurative language, there's a lot of symbolism and emotive language. So the questions relating to that extract are going to be about, the thoughts, feelings, insights, characterization of that persona. Extract B, totally different. It's an information report extract. So the language there is meta language. That means like technical terms. There'll be questions here about context. Can the students identify the words within context? There's numbers, there's statistics, there's factual information. So that's entirely different. Extract C, again, goes back to first person. So we, can assume that it might be a narrative or maybe an extract from an entertaining text, like a diary entry could be. This one's written in the present tense. Again, it has colloquial language and an informal tone. Extract D is an extract from a narrative, and it focuses really on the creation of a character. So questions about characterization, the setting, how descriptive language has achieved that is what I would expect to find there. They're not all the same. They have the same topic. They come under the same theme, but they will be different text types. They'll have different purposes depending on what type of text they come from. So I've mentioned a few ways of how to target those skills. My best advice outside of practicing the test is obviously really crucial. This allows students to see how they perform under the time pressure and also, become familiar with the format and how they perform under test conditions. Because let's face it, test conditions are abstract. They're not something that we do a lot of, and so they can be really high anxiety environments for students. So where a student might be an extremely good reader outside of the test, under a test condition, that can be different, and they might find themselves impacted by anxiety, which is quite normal and fully expected. So one way to alleviate that is through preparation, and practicing in the test environment is great preparation. Another thing I think is just so important is reading a wide variety of unseen texts. By unseen texts, I just mean unfamiliar. So not the text or the novels that, not just the novels that students read for pleasure or for schoolwork, but things that are outside of their general day-to-day reading. You will see in the samples that some of the topics are quite foreign to students of this age group, and that's because the test is aiming to look at how they can understand or comprehend information that they're not familiar with. This is the whole point of removing the predictability. It's to ask them to do something they're unfamiliar with. So the more types of text that students read and are familiar, or not familiar, but read, exposed to, is what I'm trying to say, then the more confident they will be. It also increases their vocabulary. It also increases their ability to predict and to make inferences. And again, the reading speed and confidence. Confidence is really key to this. Now, readability is something that some of you may know, educators think about a lot, teachers. We look at not only the topic that a student is reading, but the difficulty of the vocabulary, but also the density of the words that are given. So really the only way to improve that over time is by reading a wide variety of texts at home. Now, the last point I'd like to talk about is time management. This has been a critical factor for students in my experience, across OC test, the selective test, right the way through to the HSC. If any of you have had HSC students before, you'll know just how much work goes into time management and those exams that come at the end of it all. So how to manage the time, I'll just go through these 4 points. These are my top 4 pieces of advice. Using time wisely, and also then working steadily. So I find a problem for some students is they're aware that they're under time pressure, and then they race. They go as fast as they can to answer the questions as quickly as possible, and then are sometimes left with this large chunk of time at the end where they are basically unoccupied. That's not advisable. Practicing and getting that time management so that you're working steadily through both the reading sections is key. This is a message to students who are listening, probably there with parents and carers, or you can pass this information to them. If you find a question too difficult, try not to spend a long time on it. So it's better to just leave an indicator to yourself to know that, to come back to that question and come back to it at the end. Don't waste 2-3 minutes on one question, because when you think about all the questions there are, 10 or 20 questions, whichever section you're looking, you want to be able to space the time out for those questions relatively evenly. Some questions, of course, take a little bit longer to answer than others, but don't get stuck on one and then not move forward, because you're robbing yourself of all that time later on. My next point is for students to keep checking the number of the question that they're working on matches up with the, in this case, paper that they on the answer sheet. So if it's online, this is not really as much of an issue because the question, is just on the page. But if it's on paper, we don't know how it's going to continue to look into the future yet. If it's on paper, there have just been sometimes errors, especially with the pressure of colouring in the wrong bubble. Simple as that. So this is not a, do I understand the question correctly? But it could come down to you were rushing and simply coloured the wrong thing. So that's a way of checking and making sure that you're on track. Lastly, about time management, there's no time warnings. So, at school, the teacher will often indicate to you, there's 10 minutes left, or there's 5 minutes to go. Now you should edit your work or begin this section now. There's none of that in the OC or the selective tests. So you're strongly encouraged to look at the clock. There'll be a clock in the room that is the central time for your testing room. So it's not what your phone says, or you wouldn't have your phone, of course, what your watch says compared to somebody else's. There'll be one timer, and you should get used to looking up at a clock. This is maybe a silly point, but a lot of students have trouble reading an analog clock, and very often the clocks they have up on the wall at school is an analog clock. So don't rely on it being digital. If you're used to reading the digital time, make sure that you are 100% confident with reading the analog time as well, because that could be a real drama if you can't tell how much time you actually have left. So I think that's just about the end of the main things I wanted to say. And now I guess, there's some time, perhaps, David, if there are any questions.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Kelly. Very informative content. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
And You got heaps of
Oh,
questions,
sorry. So
actually.
I should go to the chat.
So let's try to find some most frequently questioned. Yeah, we know that the OC reading test, just 30 minutes time limit for 25 questions. So managing the time is the critical point. And the Jeremy asked if there is any advice how can find the main idea from the text within relatively shorter time, less time spending.
Yeah, okay. That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
The main idea should come from the introduction of the text, the first paragraph. It should really be in the first sentence or two sentences of that introduction. If you're asking what's the main idea of a paragraph, these are extracts from published professional writers. So the main idea, again, should come in the first one or two sentences of the paragraph. So the students are looking for the key words or the key ideas in the first sentence. That's where you'll get the main idea from quickly.
Okay, that's good. And Mr. Deepak, he asked, what is the best way to improve my child's vocabulary skills? Any suggested material for my child?
Yeah, it's always a interesting question, how to improve vocabulary. It really comes down to wide reading. So borrowing books from the library or reading online, the news, maybe like reputable, informative websites. So a lot of the information texts or the information reports will come from science-based articles. So look at like National Geographic or the Kids National Geographic sites even, because they've got really interesting interactive websites with lots of articles and lots of information. So that's one way. Broadly reading is the number one proven way to increase vocabulary, no matter how old you are.
I see. Thank you. And Ethan asked, I think he likes reading fictional books.
Yeah.
Does it help?
Yes, absolutely, yes. Fiction, non-fiction, they're both equally as important as each other. And actually fiction texts, you will get a lot more exposure to different perspectives and different perceptions of the world. Now, when we're looking at difficult high-end questions about inference and judgment, they are often about perspective and perception, point of view. So yes, fiction texts, excellent. Stories, like narratives, but poetry as well, or diary entries, open letters, all of those texts are very beneficial to read, yes.
Okay. Yeah, Artie asked, it seems like the poems seems to be the challenging for most of the students. So
the what, sorry?
The poetry.
Oh yes, the poetry. Yes, I know. Well, look, poetry, poetry is challenging because number one, it's an oral text, so it's intended to be read out loud, therefore heard out loud. So it being in a test anyway is just a challenge. It's poetry is about vocabulary, and poetry is about the human condition and emotions and human insight. So these are all really high order skills. You can read more poetry. Of course, that will always help. Going onto YouTube actually and listening to poetry and then listening to people explain the poetry, so you get a really good sense of the rhythm that's created. A lot of poetry techniques come from sound. They're sound devices. So ones like onomatopoeia, rhythm, alliteration, assonance, all of those are sound device techniques. And so listening on YouTube or what have you to poetry is a very good way to be able to understand then the vocabulary. That's the other side of poetry. And, I come back to my same point. Wide reading and exposure to as much text as you can get. I don't mean like 5 hours a day. One text a day. Actually, many experts recommend 20 or 30 minutes of good, solid reading a day is just about the right amount for you to be able to retain what you've read. So that's the best way to just get better with language and therefore poetry.
Thank you, Kelly. One of the parents asked, my child feels like the exam anxiety.
Yeah.
Especially if they will take the exam maybe within a month.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
any advice to reduce it?
Yeah. So it's so individual, anxiety. It's hard to give a sort of one size fits all answer, but I think that, look, there's physical ways to reduce anxiety, of course, and that's really slowing down their breathing. That sends signals to the brain to reduce blood pressure, therefore reduce heart rate, and then your whole system calms down. You're able to concentrate and read more. But psychologically, I think what brings on the anxiety is pressure. So reassuring the student in two ways. Firstly, have them build their own confidence and empowerment by, practicing in a really supportive environment. So positive reinforcement trumps negative reinforcement all the time. All the time. Students respond much, much, much better to positive reinforcement than discipline. So that's something to remember. And then also building confidence with them, I think I said actually, through the practice exams. That's maybe the best way. And the rest is really about them, their personality maybe, and how they're feeling supported by their group around them. Yeah.
Okay. We have just a couple of minutes remaining, but so I will check all the questions from our parents.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I will check whether we can make any Q&A board on our website.
Yeah.
They can check. Yeah. Okay. Just the last question. How do you identify the keywords in the gap text?
So they'll be the key nouns or the key verbs in the sentence. So some people might be familiar with the idea of parsing sentences. It's okay if you're not, but really that just means identifying the nouns and the verbs, the main nouns, subject nouns and object nouns, and the main verb of a sentence. That's where you get your key ideas from. And yeah, I just noticed here someone said, is it about the ability to understand and not vocabulary? Yes, 100% that's right. It is about the ability to understand and make judgments and inferences. My point just about vocab is that the more vocabulary a student is exposed to, the more familiar they are with these words, then the easier it is to be able to answer a question with a word in it they haven't seen before. That's all. But there's definitely the ability for them to be able to decipher what that word means within the test. So don't go reading the dictionary or trying to memorize the dictionary. That's not recommended. Don't do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question. Emily said, will the main ideas always in the first paragraph? Is that correct?
Depending on the text, yes. The introduction should give you the main idea, yes, or the heading. Depending on the text type, if it's an information report or a science report, then the heading should be the main idea. If it's an extract from a narrative, that's far more complex, and you'll probably need to broaden your thinking around the main idea, because it might emerge. When it's an extract, you don't get the first part of the text. It's an extract. It could just come out of the middle. So you might need to look for an idea overall. It will emerge as you read through the paragraph rather than just being labeled there, if that makes sense.
Okay. Now we have just 1 minute remaining.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Kelly.
Thank you, everybody.
For this webinar. And yes, I hope our parents also found this webinar is informative and enjoyable. Yes. And yes, we have another webinar next term. So have a great evening and see you again in term 4 with more updated information. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay
Thank
safe.
you. Bye.
Bye.